Airing first on Asheville FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist, anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Saligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, or send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This week I got to sit down with two members of the Portland General Defense Committee, AC, they-them pronouns, and Raoul, they-he pronouns, about the ongoing uprising in Portland, Oregon in the months since the murder of George Floyd. We get to touch on a lot of topics in this interview: the neoliberal whitewashing of the image of the city of Portland, which masks a lot of ultra-racist and colonial tendencies, personal timelines of engagement in the uprising, and a lot of tips and tricks for newer and older anarchists and radicals for dealing with and anticipating state repression and violence. Before the interview, though, here are some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a boss!
I'm getting mail from a lot of savage cannibal maniacs of the dumpster fire and ski mask variety, sharing observations about the latest cop car tipped over, or the latest statue to topple into the river, or the most recent business or government facility to catch on fire. It would seem that things are hectic everywhere. Since the height of the George Floyd protests, massive numbers of savage cannibal maniacs have gotten arrested. When you think about it, it's really backward. You can't change the world for the better until you get the current dystopia to collapse. So arresting all these savage cannibal maniacs, particularly of the dumpster fire and ski mask variety, is just pumping the brakes on real progress. Just saying. But even so, the reality confronts us that as many as 700 rebels have been rounded up and caged at one time. As a consequence, those left behind choking on the tear gas are forced to raise bail and arrange for counsel for all of their caged friends. And one of the consequences of all the arrests is there are very few people left to handle these time-intensive duties. Not to mention that those duties require a great deal of interfacing with the very kinds of people we anarchists would rather punch in the face. So the logistical juggling becomes tedious and overwhelming and stressful. I can't even imagine trying to arrange a bail fund for 700 of my closest friends. That would suck. So, I have an idea to run past you that will proverbially kill two birds with one stone. In advance of the next action, whatever it is, from fire alarm pulling to political assassination, everyone should get prepared for lockup. Get prepared that if arrested, bail will not be arranged. Now, before you reject the plan, let me explain why. First, it frees up everyone else to do other work, which is a good thing. But second, it permits those who are locked up and facing charges to tear the system apart from the inside. Think about it. From the time we get arrested, our primary focus is on getting free, fighting our cases, avoiding long-term lockup. We become completely distracted by navigating the enemy's rat maze legal system. As someone who has spent over 60% of my life in captivity, I'm not saying this is a picnic, so don't get it twisted. But I am saying that it can be survived and endured. And if there are multiple allies with you and support from the outside, your captivity can become another opportunity to cripple the police state. When hundreds or even just dozens of rebels get arrested and caged, those rebels are taking up limited beds. That's a burden on the system in itself. But imagine if, more than that, those rebels begin their own concerted resistance, organizing the other captains, developing plans to make the entire process burdensome. I know from experience as a witness to the 12-Monkey Rebellion at Mansfield Correctional just how completely that a prison operation can be ground to a halt. Rebels filling a county jail can lead dozens of strikes and refusals, resulting in a complete loss of control of the jail itself. Imagine count strikes, everyone going to wrong cells, or prisoners en masse refusing to return trays after a meal, requiring authorities to call special response teams, or busting sprinklers, or clogging toilets, or dozens taking epileptic seizures, one after another. Imagine all that and more every single day. But there's another dynamic too. County jails are filled with folks facing the criminal justice process. Rebels can that up too. Courts have deadlines for getting cases finished. Ohio, it's 90 days if you're in the county. So if you have a dozen or more rebels in the county insisting on going to trial and clogging up the court, even if it's just a bluff, you disrupt the entire court process. And keep in mind, with COVID-19 already disrupting everything, rebels in the county jail facing charges can really bring the entire criminal justice process to crisis. Need I remind you, it's not just the cops who are the enemy. The prosecutors, the corrections staff, the judges, the defense lawyers, the probation officers, and all of the systems they serve are part of this inimical matrix. While being in lockup is not fun, I know, our captivity can be a useful method of serious disruption, particularly when multiple rebels consciously use it for that purpose, radicalizing entire captive populations. Let's not forget the historical example of Gandhi. I know, I've often said Gandhi, but in this instance, cut me some slack. Gandhi arranged the Great Salt March when Britain outlawed the custom of taking free salt from the salt beach. Tens of thousands marched to the salt beach, broke the law by picking up salt, and demanded to be arrested. There were so many arrests, the jails and prisons overflowed. Officials built tent cities surrounded by barbed wire, and still thousands more flooded the system. British Parliament held an emergency session to repeal the salt law and grant amnesty to all the arrestees. By getting arrested and going to jail, thousands collectively brought the British Empire to crisis and forced it to change its low-down ways. In our own case, post-George Floyd, we can employ a similar tactic and overwhelm the jails and courts, not demanding an end to any specific law, but demanding an end to the existence of the jails and the courts altogether. We can even use the occurrence of our own captivity as an opportunity to topple the oppressor. Sometimes the operation of the machine becomes so reprehensible and so shocking, it requires us to throw even our own bodies into the gears just to make it stop. This is a chance to do that. And if enough of us do it, we can probably take this machine down without even getting any permanent scars. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks.
My name is AC, and I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a member of the Portland General Defense Committee. I'm a part of our legal support working group, so I work directly with defendants, supporting them through their legal cases, paying bail for folks, getting their financial needs met, and then sort of organizing what we call our defendant doula program. So it's a group of folks who work with groups of defendants along with us to support them through every step of their case.
My name is Raoul. I use they or he pronouns, and I am also a member of the General Defense Committee. I do a lot of communications work, so I will make a lot of stuff that is visible, or will work talking to folks who do media. I also just do general support tasks for our organization as needed, including supporting with trainings and other things like that.
So for anybody who and you're speaking from Portland, which is very much sort of in the anarchist imaginary right now, but for just before we get into it, for anybody who isn't familiar with what the General Defense Committee is and does, would you speak on that briefly?
Yeah, so the General Defense Committee as an organization started probably over 100 years ago as the legal defense arm of the industrial workers of the world. And through that time, it's had a lot of different kind of iterations of what it is. But in the last 7 to 10 years, it's really shifted to be around community self-defense efforts. One of the biggest shifts was in Twin Cities around the previous occupation of the precinct there. And that really sort of shifted the goals and mission of the organization away from just doing legal defense to also doing anti-fascist work, to doing sort of broad community defense work. So working with survivors in some places, doing mutual aid in some places, doing legal support anti-repression work. It's sort of a umbrella organization that can do a lot of different projects and activities around this concept of community self-defense. So the Portland branch kind of had a failed attempt around probably 2013, 2014 to start, and then didn't really get off the ground. And then a crew of us in 2017, coming out of the Trump election and the sort of rise of far-right activity in the Pacific Northwest, decided to restart a branch here. And we specifically started with the idea of having the organization here in Portland be majority queer, non-binary, and women. So we made it a priority from the beginning that the majority of people in the room would be women, non-binary, or queer folks. And then if that changes, that the organization has to dissolve itself. So we kind of started in the iteration that we are in 2017. And that's when also our legal support started, because we had some folks that we were close to that got some charges from some of the early stuff against Patriot Prayer. So that kind of started that part of it. Some of us have been doing various forms of anti-repression legal support work for quite a while. But as an organization, we really kind of got started in 2017, just in Portland.
The only thing that I would add is that the branches are pretty independent from one another. And so general defense committees in different cities operate kind of differently and take on different roles. So while we focus really heavily on anti-repression work and legal support and stuff like that, other GDCs in other places might be focused more on anti-fascism or other sorts of work. And I think that's probably the only thing that I would add to AC's description.
That's amazing. I love the AC when you were speaking about how the Portland branch is majority queer, non-binary, and women. I think that that's a really fantastic step towards dissolving the sort of false dichotomy between defense and patriarchy. I think that that's really cool.
A group of us has started doing some political study in 2016 around what we were at the time kind of calling relational security. And one of the things that came out of that study was the sort of importance of how you prevent, sort of misogyny and patriarchy in organizations. And one of the things we sort of came to was that comes through ensuring that the people that have power and decision making in the organization are women and queer folks. So that's kind of how that came about.
I love that. So since this show gets fairly broad, international distribution, for anybody who isn't familiar with the city of Portland itself and sort of the surrounding area, would you speak a little bit about what the city is like, especially given how Portland exists in the imagination of the average human being who has any kind of streaming services? There's the Portlandia stereotype. What are some things that folks should keep in mind about this area of the world while they are listening to you speak?
So I think a lot of folks have this very specific stereotype of a liberal city where everyone's quirky and drives Subarus and is really into woodworking or whatever. And while I think some of that stuff is very true, the city itself is in the Pacific Northwest, which historically in the U.S., so Oregon and Washington, has a very long and sordid history with white supremacy and colonialism. Mm-hmm. And so from the very beginning, when the region was founded as a a lot of indigenous genocide and anti-Black laws were on the books. In Oregon, it was actually illegal to be Black and present in the state up until fairly recently. That law was still on the books, even after segregation and civil rights legislation was passed nationally. So there has been kind of a long history of white supremacists and racists in the region that have been here for a super long time and are very organized, strong, and militant. And from my understanding on the history, I'm not from Portland. I moved here about 10 years ago. But my understanding is that a big part of the reason why there is such a big anarchist and anti-fascist scene is because of a lot of the punk influences and music influences from the 80s and 90s that brought sort of this reckoning between like this movement of fascists trying to infiltrate these music scenes, which then led to a lot of organizing for WTO and a lot of other history that has radical roots here. The IWW has been here for a super long time, but that was really in the 80s and 90s, to my knowledge. Please correct me if I'm wrong, AC. That was when we saw kind of a big upsurge of anarchist movement in the region. But that's just sort of a brief history lesson. Yeah.
Raoul's done an excellent job of laying all that history out, and I agree. And you're right, it was the 80s and 90s. The other thing I would say is that in the last 15 years, Portland has undergone a dramatic transformation. So the history of Portland is that it's been a very working class town. It's been a very industrial working class town built around the port here and shipbuilding. And, we had what was called Freightliner here for a long time. So there's a lot of sort of blue collar working class jobs in the city. And in the last 10 years, we've seen an incredible transformation of losing the majority of those jobs out of the city and the core of the city drastically changing its demographics from being a city that, when I moved here 15 years ago, I didn't pay more than $260 in rent for like 8 years, which now is unheard of, right? So it was also a really inexpensive place to live, and it gave a lot of opportunities for folks to have venues, to have spaces. I mean, we used to have an incredible culture of activist spaces in the city, but over the last 10 years, those spaces have just been priced out, right? Because our rents, just like every place else, have increased dramatically. And the core of the city has really shifted from being working class people to people fleeing California, New York, Seattle, places that are bigger markets that are more expensive. And one of the shifts of that, I think, is that in 2010, we had a series of high-profile murders by the Portland police of folks here in Portland, and there was a uprising here that existed similarly to what was happening in the Bay around Oscar Grant. And at that time, some of us ran a campaign, and you could go to almost any street corner in Portland and talk to people, and people were broadly against the police in Portland. The people had broadly had experiences across racial lines of police brutality. And that's not the case in Portland anymore, because the neighborhoods have drastically shifted in demographics. And so you have a lot of middle and upper class folks who have a very different mentality about police and policing. So I think it's worth thinking about that when we're thinking about what's happening now, that like the police struggles that we're seeing right now are also a part of a long history of struggles, especially in the Black community here in Portland, with the Portland police, and that the demographics of the city have really shifted in terms of like the core, right? So a lot of folks are being pushed out to the edges of the city, and that's creating different kind of turmoils. And one of the things that is creating is that a lot of folks from historic Black neighborhoods are being pushed further and further out into the territory of where far right and white supremacists have kind of got pushed after the time that Raoul was talking about, right? In the 80s and 90s, most of those folks that were far right Nazis and neo-Nazis got pushed out of most of the core of the city. And now we have Black and Latino folks who are getting pushed into those neighborhoods, and that's also creating a lot of tension and struggle. So that's sort of, I think, another context that's worth thinking about in terms of what we're looking at today in Portland.
I very much resonate as somebody who's lived here in Asheville for, going on 10 or 11 years at this point. I very much feel like Portland and Asheville are kind of sibling cities in this way of, this sort of like, keep whatever XYZ city name weird. This kind of like
Mm-hmm.
neoliberal tourist economy that like creates this blanket of silence around any kind of anti-status quo struggle, anti-police struggle, pro-black life, pro-indigenous life struggle. So yeah, thank you very much for talking about that. And as a town too that is circumvented by a lot of like neo-Confederate, not militia like you see in the Northwest, or not in any sort of way like militantly activated in the way that you see in the Northwest, but very much like old neocon KKK presences here in the city. I think that listeners will like hopefully get a lot out of what you said, and like realize that Portland is a very complex place that you can't just like look to a TV show to explain.
Yeah, there's a lot of animosity actually towards the TV show from long-term folks, and sometimes you see some interesting street art about things like Carrie and is his name Fred?
Yeah, I bet there's a lot of animosity towards that show, as there should be, really. So since May 25th, when Minneapolis police murdered George Floyd, who was a beloved community member and shelter worker and father, we've seen this very sort of marked catching fire of uprisings all around the country, and Portland has seen, I think, one of the most sustained uprisings that I personally have ever seen in my life. Would you describe your experiences or things you have heard about in the streets of Portland anywhere in the last like 50 plus odd days? Any notable moments or things that surprised you?
So I was out at the beginning and I've definitely not been out every day like some people have, which is really wild that people have that level of endurance and resilience. But I have been out throughout the uprising, and yeah, there's plenty of moments. The first night was wild, probably the rowdiest I've ever seen Portland get. The militancy was really kind of led by Black youth in a way, and it was probably more diverse than any sort of protest that I'd been to leading up to that point. And I used to work in like racial justice circles, so like even including those, just an incredibly diverse group of people, really wrecking storefronts, like looting, really militant and really angry and really united. And I witnessed some of the stuff that happened at the Justice Center, which is the center of where these protests have taken place, which is both the courthouse for the county, Multnomah County, which Portland is in, and a jail, so our local jail. And so the march started on the east side of Portland in a historically Black neighborhood that is slowly being gentrified, but started from there down a main thoroughfare called, I believe, Rosa Parks, all the way down to downtown, so it crossed one of our many bridges. And throughout, it, again, very militant. And sort of that first night, I think after, fires and breaking windows and like lots of storefronts getting trashed and stuff like that, targeted, right? Not indiscriminately at all. I saw sort of like people telling people not to break people's cars, like telling people to target banks, telling people to target like high-rise luxury condos, very specifically targeting sort of symbols of capitalism and people who were viewed as responsible, right? So all of that happened, and then there was sort of a big liberal backlash that pulled the protest in a very different direction, where folks were kneeling with police, and so-called peace police volunteers in the protests were like grabbing people and like trying to stop them from doing any sort of militancy. And then for a while there was sort of competing protests. More liberal groups were gathering in an area called Revolution Hall, which is an event space, a venue. And the more militant folks were going down to the Justice Center. And through a series of like internal disputes and, people having debates about tactics and across racial lines, right? Because I think what was happening very often was radicals are being characterized as homogeneously white, and Black people and other indigenous folks and other folks in the city who were being brought into this umbrella of liberal, nonprofit-y NGO folks, right? And so as a Mexican person, as a radical, right, like with folks who I know here locally who have those politics as well, being erased very conveniently by folks who are trying to shift the narrative that the only people who were leading in militancy were white radicals. And so that happened really successfully for a period of time. I can go on, but there's been sort of an ebbing and flowing of that. And what feels like now we have the feds coming into Portland more visibly, because they've been here from the beginning, more visibly, and doing snatch squads and all that stuff has really heightened and really like crossed the line for a lot of people. And so numbers are probably about as big as they were at the beginning. You know, thousands of people are on the street as opposed to hundreds a couple weeks ago, and varying degrees of militancy, but definitely not as much liberal policing of tactics that we saw towards the beginning.
And I would agree with everything that Raoul said. I think one of the things for me as somebody who's been organizing around police abolition and police brutality in Portland for over 10 years, to me, what's interesting about this moment is like we have had uprisings in the city before, but the level of militancy and increased militancy is something we've not seen, right? So there's always been sort of property destruction. There's been, you know, bigger rallies and targeting of sort of different police stations and things like that. But the like continuous nature of this has been a huge shift from what we've seen before. And, you know, I mean, honestly, I've never seen people burn stuff in Portland in the last 15 years and things like this. And like, that was a huge shift. And to me, it seems like, you know, I think there's a lot of frustration and there's an escalation in tactics, which makes sense because, you know, people have been out here doing this before and it hasn't shifted things. So police haven't gotten defunded. In fact, in Portland, until this year, right, until this recent city council meeting, that they've been increasing the police's budget, despite the fact that the police in Portland have a history of murdering young Black men over and over again, right? And we have a history of movements that have attempted to challenge that. So I think, you know, what's really powerful about this moment is that there is actually forward movement in a way we haven't seen in the past. And I would attribute that to the number of people coming out and the militancy that we're seeing on the streets, because especially the liberal electoral establishment is trying to figure out how to respond and how to quell it, right? And so, you know, our mayor, there's been a series of very interesting things that have happened with our mayor. There was an autonomous zone that was created outside of our mayor's $100 or like $1 million condo. Recently, our mayor tried to do a PR stunt here. What was that, this week at some point? Maybe it was that Thursday, Raoul? And yeah. And he got booed and people threw tear gas canisters at his feet and he got tear gassed, and there's been a lot of media stuff having choice words about his experience. And what's interesting is that I think the mainstream media have been like, oh, poor Ted Wheeler, but the feeling in the city is like, fuck Ted Wheeler. Like the feeling from people on the ground and the rest of the city, even I think like some of the more liberal circles of folks are like this guy is a mess. And it's come out, you know, that the Portland police have been collaborating with, which is no surprise to any of us that have been doing anti-repression work, but the Portland police have been collaborating with the federal police, the Portland Police Association, the quote unquote union of the Portland police. The head of their association has come out in support of the activities of the Department of Homeland Security. And so, like, I think that sort of dynamic is really interesting. And I think that having sort of a city that has lost a lot of, or almost complete confidence in its elected officials and its police force from, like, I would say 5 years ago when that wasn't the case, or even 2 years ago when that wasn't the case. Like, that's a huge shift, and it has a lot of openings for people to push and create counter institutions and to challenge the legitimacy of the state in a way that, for me, I haven't seen probably ever in my lifetime. And so I think this is like a really powerful moment in that way for those of us that are fighting for a liberated world and who are wanting to see the creation of a society without these sort of institutions that are oppressive and that perpetuate capitalism, perpetuate white supremacy, patriarchy, transphobia, and a structuring of people's lives in a way where people can't have full, meaningful lives and have access to the necessities that they need to live. I think, to me, it's really powerful to see that in some of the culture that's grown up around what's happening at the Justice Center. There's now this group called Riot Ribs that just feeds people all the time. There's constantly people that are down there handing out gas masks and other safety equipment, and folks that are medicing. There's a free clothes store. There's sort of an infrastructure that's being built that reminds me of some of the best elements of what I think Occupy was attempting to do, but didn't do very well in my reflection. And so I think it's really interesting to see that. And I'm very interested to see what happens as we fall off an economic cliff in this country. At the end of July, we lose the $600 extra. People lose their $600 extra in unemployment. Evictions start ramping up again. And I think that we're going to see a lot more folks in the street. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting to me is when I talk to defendants, and try and set up times to meet with folks, they're like, oh, I can meet whenever I'm not working. So there's so many folks right now that have the time to be out in a way that I think previously people didn't have that time, or were struggling so hard to make ends meet. And people are still struggling to make ends meet, but also they're like, I can't find a job. I'm going to be out on the streets because I'm being fed, I'm being taken care of. It's meaningful to me. The system is fucked up. Here's the way I feel agency in dealing with all of these things that I don't have agency in my life around. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens and how the movement relates to when evictions start, when people start getting in even more dire financial situations, and then sort of the fight over the opening of schools that's going to happen. So I am inspired, and I'm just going to keep supporting and engaging and seeing where things go.
That's really inspiring to hear about all of the frameworks of care that are being set up. And somebody that I follow on Twitter, which is weirdly enough where you get some of the most accurate reporting about the stuff that's going on in Portland, because it's, I think, very much being downplayed in mass media, which really shouldn't surprise anybody. But this person said this is what happens when a city collectively loses its fear of the police. And since fear is the number one tactic that police use against populations, and I would love to hear y'all speak a little bit more about specifically DHS and kind of the seemingly extrajudicial responses that has been perpetrating on the ground in Portland, especially since Portland is located next, or within jurisdiction, quote unquote, of a heavily militarized colonial border. Could you talk a little bit about DHS and ICE and sort of what y'all have been seeing on the ground as far as that federal agency goes?
So as I mentioned, the federal law enforcement has been here from the very beginning of the occupation. I mean, they have offices located here, but in surveillance and in, we've seen armed officers kind of poke their heads out from federal buildings a number of times, had confirmed sightings and door knocks and other sorts of repression of surveillance and suspected surveillance from federal law enforcement from the very beginning of the protests. ICE and DHS also have a long history in Portland from the beginning of the Trump administration, but before then as well, kind of a place of resistance because of the state's so-called sanctuary laws. So what that means for folks who are abroad, it does not mean that ICE is not allowed to deport people, as the name implies, but it does mean that it's illegal. It's not allowed for local law enforcement and state officials to cooperate with ICE unless there is a court order. And so there's limited resources and all sorts of stuff that would make that situation untenable, which limits local ICE enforcement. A few years ago, I believe in 2017, there's an occupation of an ICE facility, which lasted quite some time and lots of repression because of that, as well as, many people who have lived in Portland who are undocumented sort of have always had a fear of these snatch squads coming in and taking them away, right? So that's important context. Locally, in the last couple of weeks, when unmarked who we have now learned is probably DHS and Customs and Border Patrol agents have like snatched and grabbed people off the street, taken them to what we believe is the Multnomah County Justice Center, held them, asked them questions, spooked them a little bit, and then let them go. Clearly an intimidation tactic, right? We're not seeing a lot of charges come out of this sort of stuff. And what we have seen for sure is an escalation in the response to protests, both with more extreme sort of tear gas munitions that local law enforcement does not use, more powerful, what seems like louder flashbangs, the pepper balls and the rubber bullets and the other sorts of munitions that they're using have like pierced through people's helmets, sent some people to the hospital. Really scary stuff, right? Like deadly, sort of like near deadly force, use less lethal weapons that are by sheer luck not killing people. And so I think that has been really intense and scary because, we have sort of a contentious relationship with local law enforcement who are exercising many of the same tactics. But here it seems like DHS sort of has a carte blanche to be as aggressive as possible and to send a message, which is backfiring spectacularly. But I'll let AC talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the context, one of the contexts that matters that Raoul touched on at the end is that like these are tactics we have seen local law enforcement across the country use over and over again, right? Like ICE has used snatch squads and undercover work, right? It's a pretty regular occurrence for unmarked cars with plainclothes officers to run out and grab people off the streets, specifically usually Black folks. And we've seen snatch squads like this around protests for quite a while. But I would agree that like the acceleration of the tactics is what's very interesting, like the acceleration of the intensity of them and sort of, we have some levels of leverage with the Portland police because they are a local police force and our mayor supposedly is in charge of them. And that gives some leverage for people to have them back off in some ways, right? And there was like some court work done. So there's an organization called Don't Shoot PDX that had gotten some injunctions around the use of tear gas by the Portland police. Those do not apply to any of the federal forces that are here. I think it's really important to understand what's happening with the national security apparatus. So you have, right, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that has nationally been targeting protesters and arresting protesters, specifically around either information that they've found on social media or using video and specifically targeting people that have been burning cop cars or city buildings under sort of the interstate commerce clause. Yes, it's really weird that they can decide that burning cop cars fits under interstate commerce, but who knows? And those sorts of things have not happened in Portland. We have not had, that we know of, really any instances of the FBI operating openly in Portland at this point, which is very interesting to us because that's not the case in the rest of the country. The FBI has been sitting in a lot of places when local police arrest people and questioning people being arrested that are protesters about their political affiliation, clearly trying to map the movement that exists, trying to understand the relationship between this movement and the anti-fascist movement. And that seems to be really different in Portland because what we are experiencing is the Department of Homeland Security, which is a different part of the national security apparatus. And the Department of Homeland Security seems to be more in line with Trump. And under the Department of Homeland Security, you have ICE, you have Customs and Border Patrol, you have U.S. Marshals, you have Federal Protective Services. So all of those are the folks that we've seen at play here. One of the things that U.S. Marshals have done is that they've deputized Border Patrol agents so that they can act as if they are U.S. Marshals. That's why we're seeing them arresting people. Is that technically constitutional? Well, there's a court case that's going to be going through soon to find that out. But it does really seem as if Trump is positioning DHS as a federal police force, which we do not have in the United States, right? I think that's an important recognition for people in different countries to know. Like, a lot of other countries have federal police forces. We don't have that. And that is because under our Constitution, policing is left to states and local jurisdictions. And I think that it is troubling that Trump is attempting to create the Department of Homeland Security in this sort of model as an enforcement model, right? So one of the things that's happening now is that agents from DHS across the agencies are moving to Baltimore and Chicago, and they're actually doing patrols in the city. We have not seen as much of that. Most of our interactions with the federal forces have been around the Justice Center and federal courthouse, and specifically the federal courthouse, and have been downtown. We have had some reports of people being arrested outside of downtown now, but they're very few. But what it looks like Trump is attempting to do in the rest of the country is to actually use these forces in patrols and such like police, which is, I think, very dangerous because they have a lot less levels of accountability, and they are actually way more well-resourced than local police forces tend to be. I mean, this is the same thing with the FBI. When it comes to fighting state charges versus federal charges, one of the things that's more difficult is that, you know, the FBI has a way bigger budget and way more access to surveillance technologies and just assets, right? So one of the biggest things that the FBI does to make cases is they use informants, right? They place agents, but they often just place people who are not agents, people who they are paying or have forced through plea deals to infiltrate organizations and circles of people. And that's a lot of how they make their cases. Their work tends to be over many, many years. And they only like to really prosecute cases that they know they're going to win. So it's a very different style of repression from the FBI than what we're seeing from the DHS, which is like this really sort of brutal law and order intimidation tactic. And I think that's going to be important going forward, because I think that, you know, both of those institutions are attempting to quell what's happening, but they're going to be taking different tactics, right? So that means we're going to have to deal with them in different ways, potentially.
This is the Final Straw Radio Show, and I'm your host, William Goodenough. You are listening to two members of the Portland General Defense Committee talk about and contextualize the uprising in Portland, Oregon. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people, I think rightfully so, when they're talking about sort of the deputization of DHS into like a federal police force, making like really apt comparisons between sort of Weimar Republic and Gestapo style operations.
Yeah, the one thing I would add with you talking about that, we have seen in other countries that federal police forces are often used to also break powerful strikes in workers' movements. And the local police have often done that, but I think it's worth folks thinking about if there are really powerful worker movements or general strikes that arise out of the kind of economic collapse that we're walking into, we may see also DHS forces wading into that role, which could have some very interesting implications for those sorts of activities. When I think about this, I'm thinking about Oaxaca, I'm thinking about Mexico and the role that federal forces play there in terms of like the teacher strikes that have happened and how deadly and dangerous those situations have gotten. People should be prepared, right? Our motto as the GDC is like, we spread calm and we want people to be prepared, right? So we want people to be thinking about these things and thinking about them in a way that is strategic and is also practical, and allowing themselves to have the space of fear and paranoia, but not acting from that fear and paranoia, right? Because that's a lot of what the state is attempting to do, is attempting to get us to panic and act in ways that are not in our interest, right? Like sometimes people will come in contact with a police officer and you'll be scared and you will try and argue your case for why you should not be arrested. Don't do that. Practicing not talking, practicing not opening the door to people you don't know, like creating support plans with your community, having check-in systems with people, right? If your friends are going out, making sure you're checking in with them regularly to make sure that they're okay. All of those sorts of little things are important, and for us to start doing preparatory work now in a way that makes us more resilient and stronger will enable and empower this movement that's happening, the movements that are coming forward, to be able to keep doing what they're doing and to face and challenge repression when it comes down, because it always comes down, right? It's not a if, it's a matter of when. And we can be prepared to deal with that when, or we cannot. And the outcomes are always better if we are prepared. And if we do that sort of work with our comrades in our communities in the present moment.
Definitely. I was thinking about, all of the, things that you were saying, and thinking of that this is a very much an activating moment for people, as we've seen like an escalating series of activating moments that might push people into far left politics or far right politics. We've seen that as well. And I'm wondering, you did touch on this, but I'm wondering if y'all have any other further words of advice for people who are sort of newer to this kind of political activation or movement work. Be interested to hear what y'all had to say.
One of the things that I think has been a really hard lesson for me is to not try and do all of it at once, and to really set up clear boundaries and communication practices with the people that you're doing stuff with, and to not do anything by yourself, right? Like the whole idea of doing movement work is that you're doing it in community and you're doing it with people you trust. So establishing really like healthy practices around, saying like, look, I'm actually not capable of going out every night this week, or I'm having a really bad mental health day, or like just really checking in with yourself and having people who will check in with you as well has been something that's been really challenging, I think, for me at different times, and something I wish I would have known earlier on. And I guess the other piece is all struggle is interconnected, right? And so you don't have to do everything kind of on the same note. Like you can really dedicate yourself to anti-repression work, or anti-fascism work, or climate justice work, or immigrant rights work, or like whatever it is that you're interested in. And it's going to intersect with a ton of other people, and it's going to have a huge impact. So pick your thing that you're going to do, stick to it, and take care of yourself, I guess, are the short versions of that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'll speak from like the anti-oppression side, which is don't talk to the cops, don't talk to the cops, don't talk to the cops. Mm-hmm. So when I say that, what I mean is if at any point you're interacting with someone who may be law enforcement, just stop talking. It is a natural instinct that we have sometimes when we are faced with authority, out of fear or panic, to try and explain ourselves or whatever, right? And so I think practicing saying, I'm going to remain silent, I want to speak to a lawyer. I'm going to remain silent, I want to speak to a lawyer. Practicing that with your comrades and friends, having them practice that with you. Practicing things like keeping your doors locked at all times, looking through a window or a peephole before you open the door to confirm who that person is, so that if it is a police officer, you just walk away from the door and then you don't even have to interact with that person. Probably if you don't know a phone number, let it go to voicemail. And if it's the police, they'll leave you a message. If it's someone else that matters, they'll leave you a message, right? And then that way you don't have to worry about answering a phone number you don't know when it is a police officer on the other side and you don't know what to do. So those are sort of the like real foundational pieces around keeping yourself and comrades safe, right? If you make a mistake, which is bound to happen, I've known people who are activists for many, many years who ended up getting interrogated by the FBI for a long time. If you make a mistake, let people know, right? And be really clear about what you said, what you didn't said, what you were asked, and talk to your comrades about it, right? That's really important because it can help people know if things were said accidentally about them. It can also give people a sense of what the police are actually looking for. It's okay for people to make mistakes. It's going to happen. And so again, we should have a plan around how we support people when they do make mistakes. There is a difference in somebody acting out of panic and talking and somebody maliciously telling information to the state and collaborating with the state. And I think it's important for people to understand what the difference between those two things are, right? Is somebody actively getting information from you and giving it to the police? That person is not a person you should be working with. That person is a collaborator with the police, right? Did your friend get scared and accidentally say something? That's a different sort of scenario, right? And we're going to be faced, especially as folks are new, with a lot more sort of mistakes. You know, I think some other pieces about this that are useful, vet who you work with. So what that means is, how well do you know them? Have you been to their house? Do they talk about their family? How did they get to the city that you live in? How do they get money? Do they have lots of money mysteriously? Have you asked them about that, right? So like common things that have popped up over the years of people who are state agents, or that the fact that they just have miraculously all this money, that they don't have a very coherent backstory, that if you go to the place that they live, it's clearly not lived at, or they never let you go to the place that they live, especially if you're engaging in high-level activity with people that may result in state repression. Make sure you know those folks, because there will be potentially a time when you all have to face charges together, and you want to make sure that you all have the relationships with each other, that nobody decides to take a better deal and then turns on everyone else, right? And so part of that too is also dealing with oppressive behavior when it comes up, and bringing up concerns you have about people's behavior, and not being afraid to, in ways that are both understanding and compassionate, check people when they're out of line, right? And so I think sometimes what happens is people's relationships start breaking down, and then repression happens, and then it creates these sort of splits, and the state uses those weaknesses, right? The state looks for our divisions, it looks for our conflicts, and uses and fuels those conflicts in order to have people turn on other people, right? And so by really getting to know the people that you're organizing with, making sure your communication is clear, and that you have a process for working out conflict with each other, goes a long way to challenge that dynamic. And then the last thing I would just say is, don't use social media around protest stuff. So do you have a beef with somebody? Take it to them in person, not through social media, right? So we give the state so much information that we don't need to be giving the state by posting lots of stuff on social media. So if you're a live streamer, if you're taking photos, do it in a way that's responsible, because you are potentially giving the state information on every person in that photo, every person in that video. And for sure, I can tell you the state is going to look at every single one of those videos, every single photo that's on social media. It's work that they don't have to do. So it's really important that people be responsible with how they share their experiences. Don't, on social media, talk about the things you've been doing. Don't place yourself in protest if you have been engaging in high risk behavior, right? Like that can all make your case so much more difficult to fight, and you also can potentially put other people at risk. And then also just the airing of beefings between people is something that the state, we have seen used in the past to isolate and divide people. So if you have issues, if you think that somebody is doing something that is not safe, you and your friends get together, connect to these folks through secure methods, or connect to the folks offline and have a conversation as a starting piece, right? We should only be outing people on social media as a very last ditch effort, because that person is unaccountable, right? And so I think sometimes people feel really fluent and they have this sort of illusion of safety around it. But a lot of the FBI cases right now that are going through the federal court system coming out of the protests were literally the FBI looking on Facebook and taking people's posts about the things that they were doing and charging them on it, right? And so I think it's really important for folks to understand that piece of how social media is not actually on our side. Like, it's a tool that we can use, but those companies are also not on our side, right? And so, like, some of the conversations we are having with there's been an amazing outpouring of independent journalists here in Portland that, like you were saying, are using Twitter. And some of the conversations we've had is like, make sure you're scrubbing faces, make sure you're not taking video that's identifiable. Also know that you may be subpoenaed. Like, the major news outlets in Seattle just lost a case and are going to have to give all of their video over to the FBI and the local police, right? So those are major news outlets, and they have money and legal departments behind them. So I think, I want people to think and pause around social media before you put something out in a communication message. I want you to imagine yourself sitting in the courtroom Would you want a prosecuting attorney reading you back that tweet, sitting in a courtroom with a jury and a judge? If you're not sure, don't put it out there, because it may happen, right? So I think that other piece is really important. There hasn't been as much discussion of like the role of social media and social media companies and repression. And I think we're beginning to have that discussion. And I think especially for folks that are new, sort of the ways that repression happens is really counterintuitive, right? And so that would be, you know, one of my other things is like, just educate yourself. There's a lot of stuff that's going around on Twitter and stuff too that are talking about how you can be responsible if you're posting on social media and if you're a live streamer and that sort of stuff. And I would encourage folks to look at that information and really change their habits.
Absolutely. I think that everything that both of y'all said is super, super legit. The roles of social media, the ways that people use their phones, the sort of security blanket that people feel around their phone that is sort of a false created thing. And also, Raoul, what you said about not feeling like you have to do everything, you know, pacing yourself and checking in with yourself and really like getting to know your own boundaries and your own like capacity for engagement is, I think, super crucial to the health, safety, and strength of our movements and like this work. So thank you all both so much for going into that. So in sort of like our wind down questions, I really want to ask how listeners can help support y'all, help support the GDC, and if there is even a way to do this, sort of like the uprisings in general, especially sort of any like legal defense funds that y'all know of, or any funds to support any of the, you know, autonomous care infrastructures. Are there ways that listeners can help support that?
We have a bail fund, but I would say donate to small bail funds at this point. I think look at Louisville, I'm trying to think, there's been a couple other ones that have come across. I mean, Asheville, look at smaller cities that have had and are still having protests happening and send money to them. Like, you can absolutely send money to us. We'll use it. But at this point, I really think focusing on sending money to some of the bail funds that haven't gotten as much as us or Minnesota or Seattle or some of the other big bail funds is really important. Because those are some of the places where there are heavier federal charges. Buffalo, New York would be another one. There's a series of cases in Buffalo, New York that need a lot of material support. The Rosehip medics here in Portland are doing amazing, amazing work. They have a GoFundMe up right now, I think. They have been providing all sorts of safety equipment, things to flush eyes out, anti-chemical wipes, like the whole realm of stuff, gas masks and whatever. So that would be another group for folks to send money to. Riot Ribs has a Twitter account and takes donations. Raoul, who else am I not thinking about?
I think instead of just naming, because I think one of the things that's happening is that as an amazing act of solidarity, people from across the world and across the country are just flooding places with donations when they're in the news and when they're getting a lot of stuff. So I would just echo what AC said about finding smaller bail funds and like looking for folks who need more resources who aren't necessarily in the news as a practice. Also, I would just add, look for organizations that are Black and Indigenous led as well. You know, a lot of the times the work that's being done by those groups does not receive as much media attention or is not as highlighted by folks, even including in radical circles. So really just try and uplift and support folks who are doing great work and have good leadership and don't work with the cops. That's just, those are my suggestions.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind is, you know, find out if there's a bail fund in your city that just does general bail funding, right? Like just generally bails BIPOC folks out. We have one in Portland. It's called the Portland Freedom Fund, and they've also seen a rush of money lately, but they are like a long-term fund. So so for instance, our money goes to mostly protest cases because that's sort of the terms of our fundraising, but they can bail any BIPOC folks out no matter what their cases are, right? So that's another thing to think about, is like building up the legal infrastructure outside of just folks that are protesting. is another way to think about moving this in a longer term vision. And often that work is led by Black and Indigenous and Latinx folks. You know, there's like Black Mama's Bailout is a national version of that. And I think the other piece is like, get active. You don't have to be in a city like Portland where massive things are happening. Get together with your friends. Try and understand what's happening in your community. Relate to organizations that already exist, and like look at what your politics are and take some action. You know, there's huge holes right now around things like mental health infrastructure, right? So if we're talking about building a world without police, which is what we are wanting to do, we also need alternative infrastructure to deal with situations like when people are having a mental health crisis, right? Can you and your friends, do you have the skills, or can you get the skills to be a group of people who could respond in those situations and help de-escalate folks and get them to a safe space so that the police don't get called, right? Like that's a thing that is needed. Do you have a skill set, or could you learn a skill set and teach people in their neighborhoods how to support each other when crisis situations come up? You know, like I think looking at what are the sort of infrastructures that we need to be building if we are moving towards a liberated world without police, and do that work, right? Do it thoughtfully, but there are resources out there, and start taking some steps to make those institutions exist. Some of them might already, and it's a matter of interfacing with them, but some of them may not, you know, and this is a time and an opportunity where, as we're seeing the legitimacy of policing and also the state really come into question, you know, there are legitimate safety needs in our communities, right? Mm-hmm. Like rape is a real thing that happens. The police don't address very much at all when something like that happens. They don't provide care and support for survivors. They don't adequately deal with this fallout on the community. It's why people are so frustrated around that. Like, think about if you are positioned with your friends in a way that you could create some sort of infrastructure that could be about centering survivor healing, that could be about repairing harm in community, right? I think that those are really powerful steps to be taking in this moment as well, in infrastructure that could relate to a growing movement that a growing movement's going to need.
I think that we're definitely moving into a period where people are being actively asked to feel their own power and to step up and really sort of, create the things that we have had a chronic deficit of, like mental health infrastructures, like infrastructures that support wholeheartedly and in a real way Black, Indigenous, and brown life. All of these things are things that are so badly needed right now. And as we see the world sort of, our social order crumbling around us, we're going to need that even more. So are there any good news sources that y'all want to plug here, or, you know, Twitter handles or anything like that that people can follow for accurate reporting of the Portland Uprising?
I'm going to let you take that one, Raoul. I get it from GDC members because I'm knee deep in websites around legal stuff. So
what AC is saying is that I'm extremely online and I need to log off. I mean, there's some really great, like AC had said earlier, is that we have like a really strong presence of independent, like citizen journalists who are actually like, you know, straddle the line between citizen journalists and like published journalists. So I don't actually really know what the distinction is, but some really great folks on the ground in Portland. I would say Tuck Woodstock is awesome. Sergio Olmos, Olmos. Geez, Economy Breakfast, I think, is pretty good. There is Robert Evans, he has a podcast. It's pretty good. And all these folks will come up if you search them on Twitter. You know, I think there's a lot of organizations that I'm sure folks are familiar with that do good coverage of Portland protests, but maybe not as up to date. But for like more analysis stuff, I would say It's Going Down, Crime Think, Black Rose. Those folks are all good resources.
I did think of like a couple of anti-oppression things. So it's called Sprout Distro On Instagram, they have a lot of great graphics around sort of anti-repression stuff. The National Lawyers Guild also has an Instagram account that has some pretty great graphics, as does the CLDC Civil Liberties Defense Committee. I think it's committee.
I think so too.
They were a central part of fighting the Green Scare that happened here in the Pacific Northwest. And so they have a lot of virtual trainings around repression stuff, like how do you work with a lawyer, fighting and resisting a grand jury, dealing with ICE. Like they have a whole gamut of resources and just basic know your rights. So their website has all of that information too. So those are some kind of starting places for folks that are looking for graphics. And then, a lot of cities now have an anti-repression committee of some kind. And most of them are on Twitter and Instagram. So it might be worth, wherever you are. If you're international, I think looking at the National Lawyer Guild is connected to a number of the anti-repression committees that exist. So that would be sort of, they're not going to necessarily give you news, but they're going to give you resources around dealing with repression.
Is there anything that we missed in this interview that y'all want to give voice to?
The one thing I'll say from the anti-repression legal support, and it's just that the way that repression usually works is we're going to have, all of the arrests that have happened now. And those cases are going to start moving forward. And we expect, because of COVID, that some of those cases could take up to 2 years to fight through the courts. And then you always have, within 6 months to 2 years, a wave of arrests by FBI and local police of usually higher charges. Might be arson, usually is related to property damage or reappropriation of things from stores. And same deal, those cases can take years to go through. So I think it's really important for folks to remember that, like, there's this moment of uprising and we have no idea where this is going to go. And also there are going to be people who have been in the streets and who are going to have long-term legal processes. And so one of the ways that we can continue to support folks, because a lot of the folks arrested are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and people of color. So remembering to support folks as they go through their cases, right? So showing up to court support and packing the courtroom, making sure that you're sharing information about people's legal cases as they go forward, because a lot of times that part can be forgotten and people can still be fighting really heavy charges and not getting the kind of community support that they need in order to fight those charges. So it's really helpful for all of us to remember and for people to keep their eyes on, even as things die down, or even if they don't die down, right? Like that, what's happening now, the legal sort of court side of it will be happening for many years after.
Abolish prisons, abolish police, abolish borders. That's it.
Yes.
Build a liberated world.
Yes. AC and Raoul, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to have this talk with me. It's been really, really awesome to get to hear your experiences and hear your words about this moment and sort of the escalating series of moments and time periods moving forward. And yeah, let me know if there's anything that we in Asheville can do to help support y'all in this fight. And many thanks and much love.
Well, thanks for reaching out to us. Yeah, we appreciate it. It's nice to talk to other comrades about this stuff.
Thanks for listening to that interview with AC and Raoul, who are two members of the Portland General Defense Committee. To learn more about this group and support them, you can visit pdxgdc.com. One note on the group Riot Ribs that AC mentions. I'm pretty sure that the group has disbanded for now, but have seemingly regrouped as Revolution Ribs. You can find them at Rev Ribs on Twitter, and their Cash App is R Revolution, R Ribs. This group does not have a verified Instagram presence as far as I know. And as far as all of the links and further, resources for research, We're going to post a lot of that in our blog post at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This will be including a talk that Walidah Imarisha, who is a past guest on The Final Straw, and also a speculative fiction editor and writer herself, author of Angels with Dirty Faces. She gave an hour-and-a-half long-ish talk on YouTube about Oregon's racist anti-black history, which our guests touched on as well, called Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? We're also going to link to a lot of Twitter follows for accurate on-the-ground reporting in Portland right now, anti-repression resources that AC mentioned, and we're going to link to some mutual aid efforts, including the Portland Freedom Fund, which is that general defense fund that bails out Black and Indigenous people of color. You can find them at portlandfreedomfund.org, and also Indigenous Mutual Aid, which is a platform that started up at the start of the pandemic and has a really thorough list of Indigenous-led and centered projects in their directory that disperse funds to Indigenous folks and Indigenous-led projects. And you can go see all of that at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. And finally, there are too many autonomous local bail funds around the country to all name here, but if you do a search for mutual aid bail funds in and the name of your town or city, then that should give you a pretty solid clue about how to support places that haven't made it into the news as much. You can also do searches for Black Mama's Bailout in your area to help fund efforts to bail out Black mothers and caregivers.